The Romans are all bastards, they have bled us till we're white. They've taken everything we've got as if it was their right. And we've got nothing in return, though they make so much fuss. What have the Romans ever done for us?
What have the Romans? What have the Romans? What have the Romans ever done for us?
The aqueduct?
What?
They gave us the aqueduct.
It's been almost half a century since Edward Said published his seminal book Orientalism, a book that had a seismic effect on the way we view the history of the West, of colonialism, of the Muslim world, of the Middle East, and of the relations between them, not to mention the way we view the field of history itself. He is widely considered to be the father of post-colonial studies, and some say he is the most influential figure in the history departments of today's academia. He is also notorious for being one of the main influences on the woke state of mind that prevails nowadays. So, I think it is time to take another look at his work, see if our 2020's vision can provide a new perspective. It is time for the man who judged the field of history to be judged by history. Edward Said was born in Jerusalem in 1935 to a Christian Arab family. When the violence between the Jews and Arabs broke, following the 1947 United Nations decision to split the Holy Land between them, his family fled to Egypt and remained there. But Said did not find his place in the Egyptian education system and was sent to study in the US, where he eventually became a professor of English and comparative literature in Columbia University. His book Orientalism, published in 1978, made him famous, and he published more books and became one of the most well-known intellectuals in the world. Said was also a member of the Palestinian National Council and involved in a lot of political activism, until his death in 2003. But he was still an unknown back in 1978, when Orientalism came out. The book offers a critical reading of the field of Orientalism, a Western field that studied Eastern culture and history. Said was not a historian, but he performed a critical analysis of the texts written by Orientalists, focusing mainly on those that dealt with the Arab and Muslim worlds. The book explores the entire history of Western writing about the Orient, concentrating mainly on the 19th century, when Orientalism became a scientific field. It portrayed itself as an impartial scientific field driven by the quest for truth and knowledge, but Said shows that it contains more than that. Orientalist studies, he argues, are a closed world, where European prejudices about the Orient direct the researchers, and the facts they encounter don't change their minds because they interpret them through those prejudices. He focuses on French and British Orientalism, and shows how they contributed to the way those two imperial powers ruled the Middle East. Thus, Orientalism became an instrument of colonialism. Let me begin by saying, the book isn't very good, but it isn't bad either. It has problems that we shall discuss, but the main problem is not the book itself, but the way in which it was utilized. Not Said, but his readers. And this is mainly what we shall talk about. But let's talk about the book first. When I started reading, it antagonized me at first, because there were a couple of things that, for me, were sorely lacking. First, there was almost no discussion of the Muslim world itself, only the way it was portrayed by Orientalists. Secondly, there was no discussion of the cultural ground that Orientalism grew from, and we'll see why that's important. With those aspects missing, the book creates the impression that the Orientalists are driven not by a true thirst for knowledge, but by white supremacy and imperialism. But the more I kept on reading, I felt that I was being unfair. Said was writing at a time when Orientalist thought was dominant, and he was trying to give a different perspective, which was not presented before. When you do that, it is legitimate to focus only on the subject that you are criticizing, and not provide context. It is the job of the books that come in its wake to do that. Said does emphasize in the book that he isn't trying to say that the Orientalists were not truly seeking knowledge. All in all, then, the book is reasonable, at least compared to what came after. The problem, in other words, is the readers. Specifically, two types of readers: the Arabs and Muslims themselves, and the Western academics who are busy with self-hate and self-flagellation. The former are exceptionally bad at dealing with criticism, the latter confuse self-criticism with self-negation. The Arabs and Muslims simply use the book to deflect all criticism directed at them. The word Orientalism, once denoting a respectable academic field, became a dirty word, denoting someone who is talking about Middle Eastern people from a position of supremacy and racism. Along with Islamophobia, it is used by Arabs and Muslims to brand any criticism of them as bigotry. The second group, the Western academics, use the book to claim that the white man is incapable of understanding the Orient, or any other culture for that matter, and must accept whatever the people of that culture say about themselves. The result is that the book became one of the cornerstones of the woke religion, which regards Western culture as essentially racist, or even regards the white man as essentially racist. Hence, when we read Orientalism today, it exists within a sea of books that tell us how awful the Orientalists are, and this is why it antagonized me. But it is better than what was made from it. Here, for instance, is the closing paragraph of the book, which attempts to sum up its spirit.
Positively, I do believe, and in my other work have tried to show, that enough is being done today in the human sciences to provide the contemporary scholar with insights, methods, and ideas that could dispense with racial, ideological, and imperialist stereotypes of the sort provided during its historical ascendancy by Orientalism.
Said, then, ends on a positive note. He concedes that the human sciences have improved, and are no longer dominated by the bad things he described in the book.
I consider Orientalism's failure to have been a human as much as an intellectual one, for in having to take up a position of irreducible opposition to a region of the world it considered alien to its own, Orientalism failed to identify with human experience, failed also to see it as human experience. The worldwide hegemony of Orientalism and all it stands for can now be challenged, if we can benefit properly from the general 20th century rise to political and historical awareness of so many of the Earth's peoples.
He stresses that the failures of the Orientalists were not due to there being something wrong with white people, but simply due to their fallible human nature. And he adds that now that scholarly writings come not only from the West, we will surely do better.
If this book has any future use, it will be as a modest contribution to that challenge and as a warning that systems of thought like Orientalism, discourses of power, ideological fictions, mind-forged manacles, are all too easily made, applied, and guarded.
This is another reason why I am forgiving of this book. As we can see, Said had no idea it would become so influential. It is possible that he would have been more careful if he did. It's basically the equivalent of a shitpost that went viral.
Above all, I hope to have shown my reader that the answer to Orientalism is not Occidentalism.
By Occidentalism, he means a scientific field that will study the West, but will be as bad as Orientalism and repeat all its mistakes. The message of the book, he says, is that we should not do that.
No former Oriental will be comforted by the thought that having been an Oriental himself, he is too likely, to study new Orientals or Occidentals of his own making. If the knowledge of Orientalism has any meaning, it is in being a reminder of the seductive degradation of knowledge, anywhere, at any time. Now, perhaps more than before.
Said, then, believes that Easterners, having suffered the degradation of being stereotyped by the Orientalists, are more aware and will try not to do the same. But, of course, this is exactly what happened. In today's history departments, the Westerners are stereotyped as supremacists, imperialists, and murderous. What is called post-colonialism is, largely, nothing but Occidentalism in the sense that Said uses here. The belief that the powerless would do better once they get power has no basis in reality. In fact, those who are used to power are usually those who know how to use it in a more measured way, whereas those who aren't used to it are more easily corrupted by it. Against his wishes, Said had a big hand in constructing Occidentalism. Keeping that in mind, let's perform a critical reading of the text and see if we can do a better job than Said. I will first present a short summary of the book, and then criticize it. The first chapter begins by going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, showing how they perceived the Orient, and then continues into the Middle Ages and beyond. It shows that the Orient was always perceived as the other of the Christian world, a threatening other, and after that, the threatening other of the West. This caused all sorts of perceptions and stereotypes to develop. The Westerners didn't try to understand the East by its own terms, but always through the frightening masks they created for it. Said admits that this is natural, and that all the cultures of the time behaved in this way, but he claims that this prejudicial thinking did not disappear with the rise of the modern age, and continues to dominate even modern Orientalism. We then move to the modern age, which begins in late 18th century. One of the starting points is Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1798, which initiates the 19th century Western fascination with the Orient. In this period, the West already feels superior over the East, which was in a state of decline and decay. The West no longer fears it. Orientalism solidifies and becomes a scholarly field, and the Orientalist has a sense of superiority, as if only he can understand the Oriental man in a way that the Oriental man himself cannot, so he takes the liberty to speak in his name. The Orientalists tell themselves that they are saving the Orient from oblivion, that they speak for people who cannot speak for themselves, and that they are connecting the Christian world to its origin, to where the Bible came from. Plus, they claim to expose us to ways of thinking that are different from the Western way of thinking and complement it, and are therefore very valuable for the Western man. But Said shows that there are many prejudices infesting the thought of the Orientalists. Among them, that you can put the entire Orient under one umbrella and distinguish it from the Occident, that the sacred texts of Islam are more important to understanding it than the contemporary Muslims themselves, and that the Orient remained frozen, so to understand its essence, we need to analyze its original texts, and there's no point in exploring today's Eastern people. At the end of the 19th century, the Western empires start to take over the Middle East. The writings of the Orientalists are used as database for establishing and justifying control over the so-called backwards people that we Europeans must save from their backwardness. Orientalist study is then weaved into this imperialism and presents itself as a functional field, vital to the understanding and control of the Orient. After World War I comes the realization that imperialism, white supremacy, and racism are actually bad things, and then there is also self-criticism by the Orientalists. But Said argues that the old prejudices still thrive within Orientalism. They just morphed into something more sophisticated, and disguise themselves. That's the book, and I am not going to contest the facts presented in it, or the accusations of supremacy and imperialism. What is missing, for me, is the context. Yes, the white Europeans did perceive themselves as superior to others. Where did this sense of superiority come from? It came from humanism. Humanism regards all people as born in the image of God. Modern thought broke away from religion, but preserved a lot of its ideas, among them the idea that man is universal. But unlike Christianity, which regards man as a fallen being, modern thought claims that he is essentially good, and can create heaven on earth. He is simply too immature, and did not complete his growth yet, and because of that, he sometimes behaves in barbaric ways. The modern age was all about progress towards this maturation. Man progresses towards full self-awareness, which will enable him to create the perfect society. Science, in the modern age, is perceived as valuable only if it helps in that progress. When you read books written by modern economists, philologists, biologists, historians, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, etc., they don't just make scientific claims, but also anchor them in a discussion on how they help us create a better society. If you didn't do it, your science was regarded as worthless. Nowadays, we believe that every culture should be judged by its own values. But in the modern age, because it was believed that man is universal, and because of the belief in man's progress, it was believed that the differences between the cultures are the result of them being in different points on the progress scale. The so-called primitive cultures are simply earlier stages in the maturation of man, and will one day become enlightened like the Western culture, but right now they are behind. And because the West already went through these stages, it is possible for the Western man to fully understand and analyze these more backwards cultures. When Freud discovers the Oedipal complex, he believes he found something about the universal nature of man, so he creates an entire anthropological theory based on it, which explains how primitive cultures developed out of this complex, and how they later matured and developed into more advanced cultures. This was very typical of the modern mindset. Out of that came the perception that the white man has the obligation to export his advanced culture to the rest of the world and save it from its backwardness. This, of course, was heavily influenced by Christian missionary thinking, which transformed into the idea of teaching others to be enlightened as us. This provided the ideological basis for imperialism. Some used it cynically, but not everyone. There were many who honestly believed that this is the right thing to do. The question was, why didn't the other cultures develop? Here came philology, which divided languages into several families and claimed that the Indo-European languages are languages that keep developing, whereas the Semite languages ossified. This is why the Western man is more advanced. Later came the race theories, in the wake of Darwin's theory, and claimed that there is a racial basis to the fact that some cultures developed better. All of this served imperialism, and all of it is the product of the scientific, humanist, progressive thinking of that time. For the Romantic novelists, meanwhile, the Oriental people represented the noble savage, and many of them took journeys to the Orient and wrote books about it. Often, their encounter with actual Eastern people led to disappointment, and Said shows that they simply concluded that the Oriental of today has regressed, and is not what he used to be. So instead of just trying to understand these people as they are today, they kept on promoting the image of what they should be. All of these ideas can be found in the writings of the Orientalists, as Edward Said describes them. But he doesn't discuss, or even mention this context, doesn't explain where all of this is coming from. Sometimes it seems he thinks his readers all know this context, since they were all born in the modern age and knew all about the progress thing. But it was only partially the case back then, and certainly not the case today. Most readers today are not aware of this context. Why is this context important? Because it teaches us that imperialism, white supremacy, and racism are not intrinsic to Western culture, but the result of historical processes. Which means that once we became aware of them, we can work to liberate ourselves from these ways of thinking. The right way to read Edward Said's book is to regard it as constructive criticism, and then clean the field of Orientalism from these bad elements he talks about. Instead, it was used to claim that these deficiencies are intrinsic to Western culture, and therefore it is an immoral culture. Why did this happen? Why did Western thought turn against itself? To understand that, we'll have to talk about something else that emerged in those years, namely, postmodernism. In the modern age, because of its idea of progress, the belief was that we have a top-down view on the people of the past. We can look at their thoughts and actions and understand exactly what they were about. History was seen as having laws, and if we can figure out these laws, we will know where history is progressing. This perception was challenged by Friedrich Nietzsche in two main ways. One, He went against the idea that human nature progresses and improves. Human nature, he said, was created over millions of years of evolution, and doesn't just change so quickly. He did believe that it changes over time, but that it takes a long time, and change doesn't necessarily mean progress. The other thing he criticized was the belief that we can understand the people of the past. The meaning of words go through transformations, and ideas undergo transformations. A historian who thinks that the people of the past think like the people of today, and that therefore we can understand them, is gravely mistaken. To understand the past, we have to do what he calls genealogy. Find out when a certain word or a certain idea were born, understand what it meant in the context of that time, and then follow its transformations through the ages. When we do that, we find that history is not as linear as 19th century thinkers made it to be. Nietzsche performed some genealogies, but most of it was guesswork, based on his knowledge in philology. He didn't do any extensive historical research. The man who picked up this mantle was Michel Foucault in the 1960s, and he developed genealogy into something a lot more organized. Foucault divides history into periods, and shows that each period has its paradigm of thought, and the people of that period think within this paradigm. It doesn't matter how many times they fail, and their solutions don't work, they always find a way to explain it according to the paradigm. Only when the paradigm changes, new solutions are tried. But the changing of the paradigm also means that the meaning of words and concepts change. Therefore, to understand the past, to understand why people back then behaved the way they did, we have to perform not just a genealogy of words, but an entire archaeological process, in which we unearth the entire paradigm of that time, and understand the meaning of the words within it. What I did before was archaeology in the Foucaultian sense. I attempted to unearth the paradigm of the modern age, the ground that gave rise to imperialism and white supremacy. Today, we have a new paradigm, which covers and conceals the modern paradigm from our eyes, so when you read the modern Orientalists, they seem to simply be immoral, and you don't get the humanism at the basis of their thought. This is what allows the people of today to believe that they have moral superiority over the people of the past, and condemn them. Michel Foucault is a big influence on my thought, and I recommend you watch the video I made on him. But in that video, I also discuss some of my criticisms of him, and many of them have to do with where he diverted from Nietzsche's thought. He took from Nietzsche the genealogical approach, but not his other point, about the resiliency of human nature. Nietzsche, as we said, believed that human nature changes very slowly. If you try to impose new ideas and concepts on it, believing it will change as a result, it will always find a way to reassert itself. Foucault is a different story. We mentioned Freud's theory that the Oedipal complex is universal to human nature, and is at the basis of every human culture. We said that this is a typical example of modern thought. In his book Madness and Civilization, which I regard as one of the cornerstones of postmodernism, Foucault refutes Freud by showing how the Oedipal complex might simply be a phenomenon that belongs to the European modern man, the result of the modern paradigm that shapes his psychology in that way. It's a good theory, but the problem is, Foucault talks of it as if it is the truth. And here is where he goes too far. How do you know that this is the truth? Maybe Freud was actually right, and the Oedipal complex is universal. Maybe there is another explanation for it. The idea that the human psychology of an entire culture can so quickly change and develop the Oedipal complex simply because of the paradigm it is in doesn't seem plausible to me. Unlike Nietzsche, who believes that our nature is quite stable under the ideological changes, Foucault believes that we are completely shaped by the paradigm, and it determines even our deepest psychology. So, like the modern thinkers, Foucault believes that human nature can quickly change. The difference is that the moderns believe that there is a certain law that governs the changes, that they lead in a certain direction. More accurately, that it is the same nature, but this nature grows and becomes more mature. For Foucault, on the other hand, the changes are totally random. There is no overarching law, and no direction. When a paradigm collapses, it's not because of some illumination that people reach. It's just chance events that lead to the formation of a new paradigm. The example I provide, in my video on Foucault, is his discussion of why people were released from imprisonment at the dawn of the modern age. In the preceding age, which he calls the classical age, and which begins around the middle of the 17th century, many people across Europe were imprisoned in large holding facilities, called hospitals. Basically, everyone who was deemed unproductive to society was locked up. This included not just criminals, but also the dysfunctional, the insane, the bums, the beggars, or simply people who were an embarrassment to their family. The belief was that this will result in a perfectly functioning society. This was the mindset that prevailed for a century and a half, and its continuous failure did not convince the classical people that maybe there is something wrong with its axioms. Finally, at the end of the 18th century, it was decided to stop this mass incarceration, an event symbolized by the storming of the Bastille and the release of its inmates. This was the beginning of the modern age, and the modern people regarded it as a mark of their superior morality that they now incarcerate only criminals. But Foucault shows that what caused this paradigm shift had nothing to do with the progress in morality. One of the reasons was this. In the second half of the 18th century, the question was raised, why are the morals so corrupt? And the answer was, there is something in the air that corrupts us. Remember, oxygen wasn't discovered yet, and the perception of air as a combination of gases came only in the modern age. Before that, the air was seen as an environment that God created for us, and can be corrupted by our bad deeds and morals, or corrupt us in return. Who is corrupting the air, then? Why, it must be these people locked up in those hospitals. Stories began to spread, and the popular imagination was filled with fantasies of vile, unnatural sexual acts happening in the dungeons of the hospitals, fantasies that found their most extreme manifestation in the writings of the Marquise de Sade. It turns out that locking these people up does nothing to improve our society. They just corrupt the air for the rest of us. And this was one of the reasons why the paradigm collapsed. This side of Foucault's writing is a powerful and valuable refutation of modern beliefs, and very interesting to read. I agree with his assessment that paradigm shifts happen for random reasons. But then, for me at least, he jumps the shark when he claims that sadism did not exist before the 18th century. That is, that before that, there were no humans who found sexual pleasure in dominating and hurting others, and it was that thing that happened in the 18th century, when the European mind was titillated with the stories of what was going on in the hospital dungeons, that created this connection in our collective mind, and gave birth to this proclivity. Again, we see this idea that human nature can change very quickly, all because of the paradigm it is placed in. And this is one of the ideas that shape the paradigm of postmodernism. The meta-narrative of postmodernism is that we are completely shaped by paradigms and narratives. You can't make an argument these days without people immediately trying to deconstruct it and show how the paradigm controls you and directs you to make this argument. This undermines our ability to construct our thoughts and opens up today's academic field to several diseases of the mind. One of the worst of these diseases is of course the cult of woke. As we discussed in the past, woke takes what it needs from Marxism, postmodernism, and other schools of thought to create a Frankenstein's monster that is basically designed to give power to those who oppose Western liberal culture. In Edward Said, we already find this combination of influences, from Michel Foucault to neo-Marxists, and it only got worse after him. In the hands of the woke, Foucault's thinking led to some very bad outcomes. Here are some of the worst. First outcome. If human nature is so pliable, then history doesn't really matter. What matters is the environment you're in at the moment. Hence, thousands of years of Arab culture and more than 1,000 years of Islam are not important to understand the Arab of today. What's important is the paradigm that they are in now, where they are dominated by Western culture. We said it is legitimate that Said doesn't talk about the history of Arab or Muslim cultures, but those who came after him should have done so. Because of postmodernism, it didn't happen. The second outcome is that white men are not allowed to make any assertions about any other culture. If human nature is so malleable, then those who are in power can change it by their mere words. A Westerner who says anything negative about Oriental culture or nature is the one at fault for creating the paradigm that shapes that negative nature. This is a mindset that Said himself is already guilty of. In many places in the book, he quotes negative things said by Orientalists and doesn't even make an effort to refute them. By merely saying that something is racist, it automatically means that it is wrong. That's not enough. You don't have to elaborate on Arab culture, but you should provide at least one example to refute the claims made about it. If the Orientalist claims that Oriental culture is not open to criticism, show at least one Arab or Muslim culture throughout history that was. But Said and his followers used postmodernist thought to deflect this claim, and in that, they ironically corroborated it. The third outcome is that truth is not important. If our goal is to create an equal and just world, all we need to do is create the right paradigm, and it will shape the minds of the people in the right way. Hence, postmodern historians started to write narratives not based on historical facts, but on how they think history should look like in order to create a better world. Anyone who rejects this history is preventing the world from becoming better, and should therefore be cancelled. Of course, the moment you give people this power, they forget about equality and start creating paradigms that ensure their domination. And the book Orientalism became one of the most potent weapons in their war. This, then, is what I find wrong with the readers of the book. But there are also a few things on which I do fault Said himself. He is not an innocent here. We shall end our discussion with the criticism of the man himself. First, the closer we get to our time, the less convincing the argument becomes. Remember, Said doesn't just argue that the Orientalism of the past was full of prejudice, white supremacy, and imperialism, an argument I agree with, but that these aspects still plague the Orientalism of today. To prove it, he cites some quotes from contemporary texts. The thing is, while his readings of 19th century texts are alright, in his reading of 20th century texts, he starts to twist and strawman the words of the Orientalists to make his point. Let's take two examples. Our first example is even before the 20th century. It comes from a discussion of a late 19th century text from an Orientalist called William Robertson Smith. Said writes,
Like Burton and Charles Doughty before him, Smith voyaged in the Hejaz between 1880 and 1881. Arabia has been an especially privileged place for the Orientalist, not only because Muslims treat Islam as Arabia's genius loci, but also because the Hejaz appears historically as barren and retarded as it is geographically. The Arabian desert is thus considered to be a locale about which one can make statements regarding the past in exactly the same form and with the same content that one makes them regarding the present. In the Hejaz, you can speak about Muslims, modern Islam, and primitive Islam without bothering to make distinctions. To this vocabulary devoid of historical grounding, Smith was able to bring the cachet of additional authority provided by his Semitic studies. What we hear in his comments is the standpoint of a scholar commanding all the antecedents for Islam, the Arabs, and Arabia. Hence,
and here he quotes Smith,
it is characteristic of Mohammedanism that all national feeling assumes a religious aspect, inasmuch as the whole polity and social forms of a Muslim country are clothed in a religious dress. But it would be a mistake to suppose that genuine religious feeling is at the bottom of everything that justifies itself by taking a religious shape. The prejudices of the Arab have their roots in a conservatism which lies deeper than his belief in Islam.
What Smith is saying, then, is that some of the prejudices and beliefs of today's Arabs predate Islam. Islam turned all of them into part of the religion, but they did not originate as religious beliefs.
It is, indeed, a great fault of the religion of the Prophet that it lends itself so easily to the prejudices of the race among whom it was first promulgated, and that it has taken under its protection so many barbarous and obsolete ideas, which even Muhammad must have seen to have no religious worth, but which he carried over into his system in order to facilitate the propagation of his reformed doctrines.
Smith is basically saying that Muhammad realized that in order to win over the Arabs and make them accept Islam, he must allow some of their backwards customs into his new religion. In the same way that Christianity adopted some pagan European customs when it spread across Europe.
Yet many of the prejudices which seem to us most distinctively Mohammedan have no basis in the Quran.
The us here means us Westerners, and what he is saying is that some of what we Westerners mistakenly identify as the most distinct aspects of Islam actually don't come from Islam, but were inherited by it from previous times. It's a very simple, unambiguous, and easy to understand passage. Now let's see how Edward Said, the professor of English, reads it.
The us in the last sentence of this amazing piece of logic defines the white man's vantage point explicitly.
Right away, he sarcastically implies that this passage is illogical, meaning that it contains self-contradictions. I found no self-contradictions here, so let's see what he means.
This allows us to say in the first sentence that all political and social life are clothed in religious dress. Islam can thus be characterized as totalitarian.
No, not totalitarian, but total. Islam, as anyone who has any familiarity with it would agree, pervades every aspect of human life, down to personal hygiene. That is not totalitarian, though. What is usually meant by totalitarian is a regime that imposes itself upon its subjects' lives and erases their individuality. Said here portrays Smith as someone who is trying to antagonize us towards Islam by mischaracterizing it as fascist. But what Smith says in the first sentence is true.
Then to say in the second that religion is only a cover used by Muslims. In other words, all Muslims are hypocrites, essentially.
Here Said completely misreads the sentence. While Smith says that the origin of the custom is not in the religion, Said understands that he is saying that the origin of the acts of today's Muslims is not in their faith, that they are performing the customs, but deep inside they don't believe in them.
In the third sentence, the claim is made that Islam, even while laying hold upon the Arab's faith, has not really reformed the Arab's basic pre-Islamic conservatism.
No, it merely says that today's Muslims still believe in some of the prejudices held by pre-Islamic people. You can say that about pretty much every religion. What Said is implying is that Smith argues that Islam did not change the Arabs at all, and deep down they are the same as they were before Islam. But this is not implied in the text.
Nor is this all. For if Islam was successful as a religion, it was because it fecklessly allowed these authentic Arab prejudices to creep in. For such a tactic, now we see that it was a tactic on Islam's behalf, we must blame Muhammad, who was, after all, a ruthless crypto-Jesuit. But all this is more or less wiped out in the last sentence, when Smith assures us that everything he has said about Islam is invalid, since the quintessential aspects of Islam known to the West are not Mohammedan after all.
What Said is doing in the last sentence is so lame that I had to read it several times before I got it. Smith is talking about us, meaning us Westerners, which include himself. And, says Said, since Smith admits that the Westerners have misconceptions about Islam, and since he is one of them, it means that Smith is telling us that he also has those misconceptions, so we should disregard what he is saying. Obviously, Smith is talking about Westerners in general, and we are meant to understand that he, as an individual who studied the Orient, was able to overcome those misconceptions. Said is being intentionally obtuse.
The principles of identity and non-contradiction clearly do not bind the Orientalist. What overrides them is Orientalist expertise, which is based on an irrefutable collective verity entirely within the Orientalist's philosophical and rhetorical grasp.
Finally, after completely misreading the paragraph and turning it into unintelligible word salad, Said blames Smith that he was the one who was illogical. I would say something about the pot and the kettle, but I don't want Said's fanboys to call me racist. The second example we shall discuss is one of Said's contemporaries, Bernard Lewis, one of the most important Orientalists of the last few decades, whom Said particularly hates. The feeling, by the way, is mutual. Here is what he has to say about one of Lewis's articles.
The scholarly centerpiece of Vaticiotis's collection is Bernard Lewis's essay, Islamic Concepts of Revolution. The strategy here appears refined. Many readers will know that for Arabic speakers today, the word thawra and its immediate cognates mean revolution. They will know this also from Vaticiotis's introduction. Yet Lewis does not describe the meaning of thawra until the very end of his article, after he has discussed concepts such as dawla, fitna, and bughat in their historical and mostly religious context. The point there is mainly that the Western doctrine of the right to resist bad government is alien to Islamic thought, which leads to defeatism and quietism as political attitudes.
I didn't read Bernard Lewis, although people tell me I should, but what I understand from this is that he claims that the Arabic language generally dissuades revolutionary thought. For instance, the word dawla means both a nation and a state. Now, revolution is usually done in the name of the nation against the state, so if the language makes them seem to be one and the same, it would have a diminishing effect on the prospects of revolution. Again, a very simple and reasonable argument.
At no point in the essay is one sure where all these terms are supposed to be taking place, except somewhere in the history of words.
This is something that Said likes to do. He takes a general claim made by an Orientalist and demands of him to be more specific. I see no reason why this demand should be made here.
Then, near the end of the essay, we have this. In the Arabic-speaking countries, a different word was used for revolution, thawra. The root thwr in classical Arabic meant to rise up, for example, of a camel, to be stirred or excited, and hence, especially in Maghribi usage, to rebel. It is often used in the context of establishing a petty, independent sovereignty. Thus, for example, the so-called party kings who ruled in 11th century Spain after the breakup of the Caliphate of Cordova are called thuwar, singular tha'ir. The noun thawra at first means excitement, as in the phrase cited in the Sihah, a standard medieval Arabic dictionary, intazir hatta taskun hadhihi al-thawra. Wait till this excitement dies down. A very apt recommendation.
What Lewis is saying, then, is that the Arabic word for revolution is the same as the word for temporary excitement. This might lead the Arabic speaker to think that his revolutionary thoughts come not from values, but from a temporary excitement that he feels, which will die down if he waits a while longer. Again, the language discourages you from revolting.
The verb is used by al-ijji in the form of tawaran, or itharat fitna, stirring up sedition, as one of the dangers which should discourage a man from practicing the duty of resistance to bad government. Thawra is the term used by Arabic writers in the 19th century for the French Revolution, and by their successors for the approved revolutions, domestic and foreign, of our own time.
That's the Lewis quote. Again, a very straightforward and reasonable point, and it's hard to see why one would have an issue with it. Right? Well, let's see what Said makes of it.
The entire passage is full of condescension and bad faith. Why introduce the idea of a camel rising as an etymological root for modern Arab revolution except as a clever way of discrediting the modern. Lewis's reason is patently to bring down revolution from its contemporary valuation to nothing more noble or beautiful than a camel about to raise itself from the ground. Revolution is excitement, sedition, setting up a petty sovereignty, nothing more. The best counsel, which presumably only a Western scholar and gentleman can give, is wait till the excitement dies down.
Said, then, ascribes to Lewis the suggestions that Lewis argues that Arabic is making. Lewis says that Arabic tells the revolutionaries to wait until the excitement dies down. Said twists it into claiming that this is what Lewis is telling them.
One wouldn't know from this slighting account of Thawra that innumerable people have an active commitment to it in ways too complex for even Lewis's sarcastic scholarship to comprehend. But it is this kind of essentialized description that is natural for students and policymakers concerned with the Middle East, that revolutionary stirrings among the Arabs are about as consequential as a camel's getting up, as worthy of attention as the babblings of yokels. All the canonical Orientalist literature will, for the same ideological reason, be unable to explain or prepare one for the confirming revolutionary upheaval in the Arab world in the 20th century.
This is irrelevant. What we can deduce from the Lewis passage we read is that these revolutions happened despite the discouraging effect of the Arabic language. It actually paints the Arabs in a more positive light, as people who have agency, so much so that they can overcome this effect and rebel anyway.
Lewis's association of Thawra with a camel rising, and generally with excitement, and not with a struggle on behalf of values, hints much more broadly than is usual for him that the Arab is scarcely more than a neurotic sexual being. Each of the words or phrases he uses to describe revolution is tinged with sexuality. Stirred, excited, rising up. But for the most part, it is a bad sexuality he ascribes to the Arab.
Alright, I think we've heard enough. Said is basically claiming that Lewis is psychoanalyzing the Arab man, and claiming that he is driven by sexual emotions instead of rationality. This has absolutely no basis in the text that we just read. If we want to be generous, we would say that Edward Said, the professor of English, doesn't understand English. But I don't feel that he deserves such generosity. If these are the best examples that Said can provide, then I have to call bullshit on one of his main premises. Namely, the claim that the bad sides of Orientalism are not just a thing of the past, but exist in contemporary Orientalism as well. After reading his examples, my verdict is that he does not make his case. All the things he accuses contemporary Orientalists of are things that he reads into their texts, manifestations of his own prejudices, and nothing more. My second criticism of Edward Said has to do with the way he perceives anti-Semitism, which comes out of his discussion in philology. We mentioned that early 19th century philology divided languages into families, and claimed that the Indo-European languages evolved, while the Semitic languages froze. This led to the belief that Europeans have superiority over Semites, a belief that was further solidified with the rise of the race theories. For Said, this is what anti-Semitism is, the belief that all Semites, both Jews and Arabs, are inferior to the white man. This is categorically false. The fact that someone believes Semite people to be inferior still doesn't make them an anti-Semite. To be an anti-Semite, one has to believe that the Semite is evil. And this belief is particularly about the Jew. When the word anti-Semitism was coined, in the middle of the 19th century, it was coined by the anti-Semites themselves to denote their hatred of the Jews. The reason why they used the word Semite, and not Jew, is simply because the 19th century was obsessed with race. But it had nothing to do with Arabs, and the claim that it was directed at Arabs as well is a cheap attempt to score victimhood points. Furthermore, it obfuscates the fact that some of the most anti-Semitic texts ever written are the holy scriptures of Islam. Said, either out of extreme ignorance or out of callous cynicism, distorts the meaning of the word. and it serves to degrade his book even more. Finally, it has to be said that Middle Eastern history since the book was published was not kind to it. Said very proudly points out the processes that happened in the Arab and Muslim worlds in the 20th century, like the revolutionary activity, the anti-imperialist movements, the rise of secularism and socialism, and more, and claims that they refute what the Orientalists said about the region. Alas, we look at the Middle East today, and we see that none of these imports from the West took root. The revolutions did not lead to nation-states, but only to dictatorships, and where the dictatorships collapsed, the societies disintegrated into tribes and sects. Meanwhile, Islamism and jihadism took over Muslim discourse, and led to fanaticism, violence, and terror. The Middle East, it seems, does everything it can to affirm everything that the Orientalists ever said about it, leaving Edward Said's legacy to rot. The only place where he is still relevant is in the Western academies, and this is one of the reasons they are rotting as well. It is time we went back to discussing actual history, and actual historians.